At this stage, I'd like to invite to the stage Dr. Nikki Murdoch, President of the Paediatrics and Child Health Division.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for everyone for coming today. It's a pleasure as the Paediatrics and Child Health Division President to introduce the Howard Williams Medal winner, Professor John Whitehall. He will present his oration, which is entitled Mustard Seeds. Professor Whitehall has a special interest in international health, and it says he feels fortunate to have worked in a range of roles across the world, but I'm sure that it hasn't just happened. I'm sure he's driven that himself. He's worked in a refugee aid program in Vietnam, a remote mission hospital in South Africa, the university hospital in what was formerly Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe, in an aid program in Sri Lanka after the Asian tsunami, and then recently is visiting lecturer in the Northeast. Over Christmas, he worked as a locum physician for a couple of months in Madagascar. Professor Whitehall works in Western Sydney and was involved with aid organisations in Guam for refugees from Vietnam, East Timor during the First Civil War, the Lebanon during a pause in the wars, and in the Philippines during the Revolution, and then Mexico. While working in Townsville, he's developed and presented courses in tropical paediatrics, and this has involved an annual block of study in Sri Lanka, Papua New Guinea and Bangladesh. In Australia, presumably because he wasn't busy enough, Professor Whitehall retrained as a neonatologist and developed a particular interest in fetal medicine and echocardiography while working in the intensive care unit in Townsville. He's a keen interest in public health in association with the James Cook University and was a member of the small group that prepared the way for the School of Medicine at James Cook. He remains involved in all these areas through general paediatrics in Sydney, where he has clinical responsibilities as well as teaching, working on committees, presenting and research. He's written a book, with some help, The War and Medicine, a collection of short stories based on the experiences of medical practitioners in the Civil War in northeast Sri Lanka. So please join me in welcoming Professor Whitehall to the stage.
Well, thank you. I wish to acknowledge the honour that the college is about to bestow on me. At the end of this talk, I understand. I am both grateful for it and right now intimidated. After the last talk about the great Bristol scandal of mortalities, when I confessed some of the mortalities that have plagued my life, you can go back to England and write that you have met the bloke now known as the great Cairns scandal of paediatrics. So I'm intimidated. Lots of people have done a lot more for paediatrics than I ever have or will. So why did I get it? Well, I think maybe my only thing going for me is endurance. I am surprised, as indeed the Journal of Paediatrics seems to have been surprised when it published its 50th edition this year. It seemed to have be surprised to have lasted so long, and indeed the calendar tells me that I should be, if not grateful, certainly surprised that I have endured, or the general public has endured, 50 years since I was let loose as a medical practitioner. I have also endured and continue to endure not only other people's children, but the continued challenges of my own adult children, and the 15 and a half, according to my wife, latest count of our own grandchildren, and indeed 2 who are no longer with us. So if you get a prize for enduring paediatrics, I think there should be a prize for enduring paediatricians. And at this stage, I would like to nominate my wife Elsie in the front seat, for the calendar tells us that next year she will have endured 50 years of marriage to me, for which I am very grateful. The Journal of Paediatrics chronicles enormous changes in its most recent edition. It was terrific to read it, really inspiring to read it. And one thing about medicine I find is it gets more inspiring the longer you get. And it was terrific to read of those things, and it has been a privilege to me to have observed some of them, perhaps especially in neonatology, which appeals to me. I can remember, it seems like just yesterday, that we never even bothered with children weighing less than 1 kilogram at birth. And if we did bother, they didn't last long on those big adult ventilators that we tried to wind down for volume control. And one of the reasons, of course, was at that stage we only had rubber endotracheal tubes, and after a while they would rot the epiglottis. And of course we didn't have TPN, nor did we have any way of sustaining it. There were such things as PICC lines, and there were those little steel-shanked needles that you could perhaps have in place for a while if you created a mountain of plaster of Paris around them. Things were different then. We had a Gregory box for CPAP that wheezed and hissed and seemed to prolong existence. But we only guessed at oxygenation. That was something you eyeballed. Or if you were really worried about it, tried to get some blood out of a multi-punctured radial artery, put it into a little cup with ice, send it off, and in the matter of hours, maybe, if you're lucky, you would get back a result. Things were different. I remember the first ultrasound I ever saw, which was a black box with a little wavering needle. It seemed ridiculous at the time. It had a wand that you put on one side and it would measure the distance from here to the falx, and then you do it on the other side as if it really was a common thing that the falx was not where it ought to have been. It seemed useless. And I didn't look at ultrasound for years, and then I was engrossed, fell in love with the beauty of the colours and so forth. Things have changed. That it's allowed us to do surgery. I was in the NICU in Townsville for a long time. And because of the advances in anaesthetics and the ability to look after the children, I saw something I could never have imagined. Harry Stalusky, the surgeon down there, do. We had a child with a short esophagus. And no way they could have joined the top to the bottom. So with female cervical dilators, one day, starting early in the morning, he made an incision down here, burrowed his way up behind the heart, and then ultimately swung some intestine to join from here to here. And last time I heard, the child was thriving. These are enormous and unimagined, exciting things that have happened. Not only technically, in the rubber to the plastic tube, but in our understanding and our knowledge. Each day, you can't keep up with the literature, and each day it's more and more exciting. I have, as already been confessed, another interest, and that is in children in other countries, and I rejoice that the understanding in their illnesses is also surging. There's been an enormous upsurge in understanding of the pathophysiology of malaria in recent days. It's a bit macabre, I suppose, but out of Malawi they've just produced the first long series of post-mortem results looking at how this strange cerebral malaria seems to affect you. And we understand the genome of the mosquito, of the parasite, and people are looking at the genome of children who are particularly affected to see if there's some sort of genetic predisposition. So we can look down with electron microscopes and actually see it catching onto the red cell, invading the red cell, and then eating the globin while compartmentalizing the heme for the risk of, for the aim of avoiding oxidative damage. We can see that it gets in there and it causes the red cell to put little hooks out through the wall, and at the same time encouraging little hooks to come from the endothelium so that the hooks grab, and somehow or other the parasite knows that it's best to hang on rather than get swept through to a ravenous spleen. We know about schistosomiasis, and we know about the GIST gene expression, which allows a phenomenal transition from egg in form, from egg to miracidium, to look for the snail, to an asexual reproductive form within the snail, to the release of cercariae, which then look for a human host, then more gene expression to turn it into a sister somule, which knows its way around. How does it know where to go? To set up home in distant venules, right where its eggs can then pass into the urine with hematobium. or into the intestine with Manson-I. These things are enormously fascinating at an intellectual level. Great advances. We can do the genome of TB, and we know how it is resistant and how it manipulates and evades the immune system. We know about the immunological basis for those weird complications that come with leprosy, type 1 reaction and type 2 reaction. We know about the protein arrangement of tetaноspasmin, which comes from tetanus, of course. And even in the Pediatric Advanced Societies meetings in April, I went to a session, and they now know the composition and the identification, the amount, and the DNA composition of the microbiome in the intestines of children with kwashiorkor. Can you imagine that? Such enormous brilliance, such light, matched by such darkness. Because as we're sitting here, although we know all about those things, children are dying from them. I was in Madagascar, where children died from malaria, and not like flies, but I suppose like mosquitoes. No matter what we did, it was brutal. The whole concept of impregnated nets and regular prophylaxis was completely unknown to them and to many other places. Now, I know that the statistics produced will say there's big improvements in certain parts of the world. I know that. Now, maybe you can criticize me for not seeing the wood for the trees. But we had children dying almost every day of malaria, no matter what we did. And one child, we looked down the microscope in this obtunded child, and almost every red cell was parasitized. Every red cell. She was obtunded, acidotic, and anemic. And I thought if there's ever time for a exchange transfusion, heroic exchange transfusion, and now I'm getting a bit like the Bristol people, this was it. So I thought, I'm a neonatologist, I can do this easily, bounding pulse. Yeah, well, later on we devolved into a cut down on the femoral vein in the middle of the night, in a hot tropical night, and ultimately we were able to exchange. In the morning, I was astonished. The artemeter we had given and the exchange, there was now hardly a parasitized red cell to be seen. It really worked, and the child seemed to be getting better, and so did the one opposite. It was equally obtunded, not quite as acidotic or not quite as parasitemic, and I thought, we're going to pull this off. So rather cockily, the next day I went along at 7:30 in the morning, and there were both little beds empty, with the children wrapped in cotton, cheaper for the burial. They died no matter what we could do. They died of bilharzia, of schistosomiasis. I'd had a bit of fun at the beginning of that, and I'd watched down the microscope in awe at one of the eggs thrusting with life, as it attempts to deal with a change in salinity, its flame cells flicker as it goes from the salinity of the human being into the water, the fresh water, and then into the snail and so forth. And I was watching these little fellows, the little flame cells going. I didn't actually see the birth, but suddenly a miracidium appeared, dashing all over the place in a frantic search for its snail. It went so fast and so far that I wasn't able to photograph it. And then suddenly it died, poor thing, and I got a nice picture post-mortem. The little boy who was the possessor of that of that parasite, I asked him, and perhaps unethically, well, next time you go for a bath in the river, can you bring me some snails? So he brought me some snails, and we put them in fresh water and put them in the sun when they're supposed to let the cercaria loose. We distilled it all down, had a look under the microscope, and blow me down, there was a cercaria, dashing and thriving and writhing all around, looking for a human host. The only problem was the little fellow was only his brother who had it was only 1 year old, presenting with hematuria. Most of the children had hematuria. This one had hematobium. I followed with an old ultrasound, and by several years of age, their bladder walls were thicker, and they had begun to get polypoid excrescences. By the time they were 10 or so, the bladder was almost filled with these polyps. By the time they were in their teens, they were in chronic renal failure, and by the time they were in 30 or so, there was probably bladder cancer. And all this is treatable with praziquantel. I was in Bangladesh visiting a TB ward, and I felt a bit cowardly when they said, here, put this mask on, until they said, well, you know, I really think you should, because almost all the people have got resistant TB. So I put the mask on, and we wandered down the ward, and at the end of the ward there was a girl, a teenage girl, who was just walled off by the old-fashioned screens. And she was dying of tuberculosis. And they said to me, the problem is she is total resistant. And I had never heard of that until last year. What do you mean, total? She said, yes. The only thing to which the germ seems to show some sensitivity is amoxicillin, which she was on. And nobody expected that to work for very long. So she is the fourth case of total resistant TB in that crowded city, and the first three had absconded into the slums. Every year we go, we see children with tetanus. Every year we go, we hear about rabies. I've fortunately not seen one, but there's a huge rabies issue there. Every year we go, we see children with more and more leishmaniasis because the population is extending to the rural areas. And in the rural areas, everything is complicated by the fact that most of the wells are now contaminated with arsenic. These are big issues, and it is dreadful that they are dying for so little when we know so much, including kwashiorkor and malnutrition, which seems, to my observation, as bad now as it ever was in Africa years ago. It's bad that children die of lack of food, and it's bad they die of lack of medicine, I agree, but there are worse things. That children die as a consequence of warfare. I saw that very plainly when I was working in Vietnam. I saw it even more plainly in 1975 when, in an extraordinary experience, I went in a fishing boat with Kerry Packer and Gerald Stone and Brian Peters, who was subsequently killed in Ballabo. We came outside Dili just at the conclusion of the fight over the city, and Dili was ringed with fire. We went, and I went to the hospital. The Portuguese doctors had left some days before. I have never seen a hospital like this, and I hope never to see it again. There were over 70 people maimed and in the process of dying without any treatment and without any hope. The filth was incredible. There were feces and blood and flies and just an overall terrible sense of hopelessness and most of them were children, caught accidentally, in this case, I believe, but accidentally in a civil war. The second child that I looked after was only 8 years old, and he was nearly dead. A bullet had exploded through his femur, and his leg was gangrenous. It was high near the joint, and fortunately, against all odds, he survived, and including my surgery, so at least I got one on the board. It was balanced by the next one. I haven't told you about. The first one was a girl, a rather obese girl, who also had a gangrenous leg. The leg came off okay. She had 3 little tiny punctures in an obese abdomen. And I thought, they're just little things. I tried to cut down to see where they ended. I thought they were ending blindly. They didn't, and she died of peritonitis. The next child was a girl shot through both elbows, and so forth and so on. It went on and on and on. But these children, I suppose, and that's happening today in the Middle East, these children, I suppose, were caught by accident. What I had already learnt was that sometimes children are not just accidental victims in war, but they are objects of war. Who can believe that? When I was first in Vietnam, I had to drive from one little town to the centre, about 30 k's, and the road was impregnated stones, rose from the rice paddies, and you could see the tree line on both sides, and it wasn't a great idea to be first on the road because there are often mines and other things. So that day I felt safe because there was a patrol of Americans in armoured personnel carriers who'd come up and got onto the road first, and I followed in behind. It was slow and it was dusty, but I was content. We all did go over a mine, but we were not the chosen victims. What remained of the chosen victims were presented to the hospital about an hour or two after I arrived. The chosen victims was the civilian bus, and you've been to Asia, you've seen them. It's filled with pigs and chickens and Coca-Cola and stuff like that, but women and children. This was an intentional act to destroy the women and children, to demoralize the population. The children were the objects of the war. Now, that was in 1975. Only a few years ago, I was in another country that was gearing up for a final solution. I was minimally involved with a little place that looked after 20 blind children and about 60 deaf children. There's not much I could do. Nothing I could do. I got called one night because one little boy was in a lot of pain from a fungating tumour, and the generator had broken, so all I had was an Aladdin light, and I was looking with kerosene light, looking at his eye, trying to mutter some words of comfort and give him some paracetamol. A lot of use that was all we had. Now then, he put his little hand in mine and assumed that I would then take him to where he slept across the playground. But I didn't know where he slept. And I stood there speechless, lost for words, with the little boy in my hand. And then, to save the night, another little boy, partially sighted, who'd been in the shadows, came forward. And he took the little boy's hand from mine, and they felt their way out. And I shall never forget their backs merging with the darkness of the night. Everyone knew what that institution was. It had been there for years. Its aims and objectives, its people were known. The spies for the attacking side knew what it was. Its coordinates were known and proclaimed internationally and locally. There were signs on the roof, and the attacking side had drones that patrolled regularly. These days artillery does not fall by accident, but it is designed, controlled, directed, observed. And that was destroyed in artillery fire. The people, women and children predominantly, were advised to go to another location whose coordinates were proclaimed. This was a safe fire, no fire zone, safe for civilians. And the shells fell on it. The survivors were then advised to go to another one, proclaimed, defined geographically, and then shells fell on it with such ferocity that neutral observers described bits of children hanging in the trees. Who can understand these things? I suppose you can. In the madness of war, the human heart does terrible things. Who can understand? But then there are terrible things in the coldness of a human heart. In PNG, only recently, I was taking students. It wasn't my responsibility. There were two little fellows there with kwashiorkor sitting miserably in the corner. After a couple of days, I noticed they were no longer there. Well, where are they gone? Well, they went home. Well, what do you mean? Well, they went home. Why? Well, they wouldn't eat. There's no point. So what do you mean there's no point? Why don't you nasogastric tube? Oh, well, there's no milk. What do you mean there's no milk? I knew there was milk. It was coming from various organisations. So I tracked it down to the nutrition centre run by three suspiciously corpulent ladies, and indeed there was no milk. Is there any oil? Oh yes, here's the oil, half a bottle of rancid oil. It was being flogged, of course, and sold on the markets. In Madagascar, we had a boy about 12, looked like he'd just come out of a concentration camp. Belsenish. We thought the government, we were in a mission hospital, we thought the government hospital provided this kind of service, that's what they were saying, so we sent him there. He sat there for 3 days with no food, just some water by his parents. Despite the fact that doctors were receiving the salary, the nurses were receiving a salary, provisions were being sent to the hospital, there was nothing. We went to pick this kid up and we didn't have a stretcher. I picked him up. I was astonished by his weightlessness. We tried to feed him. He got diarrhea and then he got hyponic and then he died, and his dad took him home because it was cheaper to die at home than it was otherwise. These things are happening on purpose. And I haven't got time to talk about sexual abuse of children. In 1978, you could buy any amount of child pornography 100 metres from my office in Fairfield. I got a bit involved. I used to speak with the Printing and Kindred Industries Union. Their workers were complaining that they were having to produce this stuff, and what can they do about it? We had a big conference, brought people from America in as early as 1978. And the Vice Squad said, this is not being produced here, you're just being conned, you're making a fool of yourself, it's all coming from overseas. And we now know that leaders of the Vice Squad were in a protection racket. These things go on and on. Why get involved? Why get involved in this Sisyphean task? And Sisyphus was the Greek person who was condemned for his sins to push a rock, a boulder, up to the top of the mountain, and then it would roll back down endlessly. And this overseas stuff looks Sisyphean. Why get involved? But there's a cost. In one venture, when I was a medical superintendent of a group when we went to Lebanon, 2 people were evacuated for psychological reasons in the first month. In the second month, none of us were smiling. In the 4th month, it just was really, really painful. Why get involved? Why take on the Sisyphean boulder? Well, here I must get personal. I don't expect you to agree. Everyone's got his own pathologies, I suppose, and this is mine. Why do it? Why do I get involved? Why will I do it next Christmas, lined up on the helicopter to get to Madagascar? Because I lament. I lament with St. Paul in his letter to the Roman people, the Roman Christians, that all of creation is groaning as if in labour, the agony of labour. And we know that. But there's a hope to it, because when the agony is over, he says there will be the new birth of a day which will be painless and not suffering. That's foreshadowed in Isaiah in the Old Testament, where it talks about a day when the children will no longer be weeping, and the children will no longer be crying, and weeping will no longer be heard. Well, that's all very well, that's for the future. But what about now? What do we do in the meantime? Well, Jesus in the New Testament says that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, then you can remove mountains. I know lots of people who have faith smaller than the size of a mustard seed, and I don't see too many mountains being moved. What does that mean? James, the brother of Jesus, said that you show your faith by your works. Well, now we're getting a little closer. Perhaps then the mustard seed of a work which is almost so small you can't see it moves mountains in realms we don't understand. Or, looking at it optimistically, that biblical analogy is that a tiny mustard seed, from a tiny mustard seed there will grow a big tree, and in the big tree birds will rest. What does that mean? This is the concept of peace and plenty and protection. What does believe mean? What does faith mean? It means to adhere to, trust in, rely on. I believe in mustard seeds.
So on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to thank Professor Whitehall for his oration. I think listening to the two speakers this morning, on the face of it, very different stories, but then when I reflect, I think it comes down to perseverance and an ability to keep going, even though at times livelihood or health or safety has been threatened. And I think really both speakers quite inspirational to us today. But I'd like to present Professor Whitehall with the medal just now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I supposed to shake your hand? Yeah. Give you a kiss? Thank you. I told you it wouldn't last long.